This is a wrong relationship. A man fell in love with his best friend's wife. What they did made the whole town condemn. So what happened in the end? Please stay and listen to today's story. I believe what I'm about to tell will surprise you. Welcome to the new channel daily Unexpected Story. Luke Bennett's apartment was small. The walls painted a pale gray so empty that each footstep echoed in his heart. On the bookshelf in the corner of the room, a dusty silver photo frame marked the moment when the three of them stood together, him, Mark, and Grace. Mark stood in the middle, his arm around his best friend and wife, smiling brightly. Luke couldn't remember how many times he had stopped to look at this photo, feeling both warm and heartbroken. Mark was gone. A traffic accident had suddenly taken him from this world, leaving a void that was hard to fill. In his last moments at the hospital, Mark held Luke's hand, his voice hoarse, but his eyes determined. "Take care of Grace and Sophie for me. Don't leave them alone." That promise had become Luke's burden and support for the past 2 years. He kept his word, but never stopped wondering if he was doing the right thing. Saturday morning. The smell of roasted coffee wafted into his nose as Luke locked the apartment door and drove to Grace's house. The road through the small town, the maple trees had begun to change their leaves. The scenery was so familiar that he could close his eyes and still know every turn. Grace's house, a white wooden house with light green trim, was at the end of a quiet street. When Luke stopped the car in front of the gate, Sophie's laughter rang out from the porch. "Uncle Luke." Her voice rang out clearly, her small feet trotting out the gate, her curly brown hair flying. "I've been waiting for you." She smiled happily, her cheeks flushed from the morning wind. "Good morning, little one." Luke bent down, reached out to gently stroke her hair, the corners of his lips involuntarily curling up. "The faucet in the kitchen is broken again." Sophie tilted her head and said, her expression as serious as an adult's, "Mommy said only you can fix it." Her voice lowered, as if whispering an important secret. Luke chuckled softly, shrugging. "Luckily, you're good at fixing things." He glanced up at the porch where Grace had just stepped out. Grace was wearing a thin, cream-colored sweater and simple jeans, her hair tied back neatly, but a few strands still falling over her cheeks. Her smile was gentle, but her eyes were a little shy when she caught sight of him. "Good morning, Luke," Grace said softly, wiping her cake-stained apron. "You're earlier than I expected." Her voice was soft, but a little shaky, as if she was both in a hurry and unsure of what else to say. "The roads are quiet today," Luke replied, setting the toolbox down on the porch. "I thought I'd finish fixing it before breakfast." He tried to keep his voice calm, but his heart still churned every time he stood in front of her. The wooden house was filled with the smell of butter and cinnamon, a smell that evoked a sense of home. Luke always liked that feeling, even though it made him feel both warm and distant. He walked into the kitchen, started fixing the leaky faucet, while Sophie stood beside him, asking all sorts of silly questions. "Luke," she tilted her head, her big eyes sparkling, "do you ever feel sad?" Luke looked up, surprised by the question. "What are you sad about, little girl?" he asked softly, still turning the screws. "About Mark." Sophie lowered her voice, her eyes downcast. "I miss my dad so much." Her voice caught her small hands clenching the hem of her shirt. Luke's heart clenched. He put down the wrench and bent down to Sophie's eye level. "I miss your dad too," he said, his voice low but warm. "But I know he's watching from above." Sophie looked up, her eyes sparkling. "Really? Really?" Luke chuckled, then touched her nose. "And he would be proud to see you so strong." She nodded, her smile growing. In that moment, Luke realized he hadn't just kept his promise to Mark. He truly loved this child as if Sophie were a part of his heart. Saturday mornings had become a routine. Luke would come to fix things, clean up, or just play with Sophie, then have breakfast with Grace. No one said it, but it seemed like all three of them looked forward to this day every week. They ate breakfast around the old wooden table, the place where the Mark family used to sit together. Grace poured milk into a glass. Sophie was busy coloring beside her. Luke sat opposite, eating pancakes and secretly watching the light through the window shine on Grace's hair. "Uncle Luke." Sophie suddenly said, her eyes still glued to the coloring sheet. "Why don't you live with us?" Her voice was innocent, but the question rang like a bell in the room. Grace paused, her hand, holding the milk bottle, trembling slightly. Luke stopped eating too, his throat dry. He chuckled, trying to hide his confusion. "Uncle has his own place, kid." He scratched his head, avoiding Grace's eyes. "But you come here all the time. You fix things for Mom, play with me, eat breakfast with me. You're like Dad." Sophie continued, her voice innocent but sincere. Grace lowered her head. Her lips pursed. She didn't blame her daughter. Children only say what they see. But that question made the atmosphere in the kitchen quiet. Luke took a deep breath, smiling gently at Sophie. "I'll always be here when you need me, even though I don't live with you, but you'll never be alone." He spoke softly, his voice like a promise. Sophie nodded in satisfaction, then happily continued coloring, leaving Luke and Grace in an indescribable silence. Grace spoke softly, her voice small but warm. "Thank you, Luke." Luke looked over their eyes, meeting for a moment. He saw something in Grace's eyes that was both grateful and shy, a feeling that neither of them dared to name. After breakfast, Sophie pulled Luke out onto the back porch to check out the secret base, a corner of the garden where she had piled pillows and cardboard boxes like a small castle. Luke sat down on the steps, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching Grace through the kitchen window as she washed the dishes. He didn't know when it had started, but the feeling in his heart had gone beyond the promise. She was no longer my best friend's wife, but a woman he loved secretly, quietly secretly, and perhaps would never dare to admit. Luke, Sophie called out, "I need a doorman for this secret base." "Are you ready?" Her voice rang out like music, making Luke laugh. "Ready, Captain," he said, standing up and approaching. The morning passed, amid the laughter of children and the smell of damp earth in the backyard. Grace occasionally glanced out, her eyes soft, and in those moments, Luke felt a part of him belong here. In the afternoon, after returning to his apartment, Luke lay on the old sofa, holding a cup of tea, but not drinking it. Outside, the wind blew through the open window, blowing a few work notes. He closed his eyes. Memories of the past came back. There were 3 inseparable friends from college, Luke, Mark, and Grace. They used to bike through the woods together, camp on summer nights, and sing karaoke drunk in the middle of a small town in their senior year. Luke had liked Grace, a gentle feeling, not loud, but clear as sunlight through the curtains. He knew Mark liked her too, and when the two of them got together, Luke congratulated them with the most sincere smile he could muster. Then he stepped back, playing the role of best friend supporter. He did the right thing, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. "You never say it," Mark said once after getting drunk, "but I know. Thank you for always choosing friendship." Luke still remembers the look in Mark's eyes when he said it. There was no pity, just understanding between 2 men. And now Mark was gone. Luke kept his promise, taking care of Grace and Sophie the way Mark wanted. But what he couldn't face was the fact that his heart was beating for someone who no one else owned, but who could never be his own. That evening at the small bar near the town post office, Luke met Tom Harris, a co-worker and the only person he could share his true feelings with. Tom was a short, stocky, bald man who joked around but whose eyes were sharper than his humorous appearance. "Still black coffee." Tom laughed when Luke ordered his drink. "You know, Luke, with the amount of caffeine you consume, you should be sponsored by Starbucks." Luke chuckled, but his eyes darkened. "I was just at Grace's." Tom leaned back in his chair, tilting his head. "Saturday as usual." "And, as usual, you came out here to avoid your own feelings, right?" Luke didn't answer. He took a sip of his coffee, tasting the bitterness creeping into his tongue. Tom sighed. "You know, I used to think you were the cool, collected type. Now I think you're the type of guy who's afraid of his own feelings." "Not afraid," Luke said slowly. "It's respectful. Grace deserves to be free, not tied down by someone who's trying to keep a promise to someone who's dead." Tom was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. "You make it sound like loving someone is selfish, because sometimes it is," Luke replied softly, his eyes looking out the bar window, where the wind was blowing the first leaves of autumn. On Sunday morning, Grace went to the town supermarket as usual. The air in the supermarket was quiet, except for the sound of trolleys rolling on the tiled floor and soft music playing from the ceiling speakers. But whispers began to creep into her ears. "He's at her house all the time again. I heard they didn't last long after Mark died. Poor Sophie, she doesn't know what's going on." Grace stood still for a moment in front of the cereal shelf, her hands clutching the box in her shopping cart. She took a deep breath, trying to ignore it, but the ache spread through her chest. When she got home, Grace put her shopping bag on the kitchen table, forcing a smile at Sophie, who was playing with blocks on the floor. But in her head, the whispers kept ringing. Luke came over that afternoon carrying a toolkit to fix the hinges on the door. He immediately noticed the change in Grace's eyes. "Are you okay?" Luke asked softly, putting down his bag, his voice laced with worry. Grace hesitated for a second, then shook her head. "Not really. I heard them talking in the supermarket today." Her voice dropped, her eyes looking out the window. "About you?" Luke guessed, his voice hoarse but calm. Grace nodded slightly. "About us. They think—" She bit her lip, unable to continue. Luke moved closer, placing his hands lightly on the armrests of the chair. "Grace, they don't know anything. Only we know the real story." Grace smiled slightly, but it was a shaky smile. "Sometimes I think, if Mark had lived, this would never have happened. And I hate myself for thinking that." Luke was silent. He couldn't find the right words. Instead, he just nodded, a knowing nod, as if to say, "I'm going through it too." That night, it was raining heavily. The sound of the rain hitting the roof echoed throughout the house, mixed with the wind whistling through the maple trees in the backyard. The lights flickered and then went out, plunging the house into darkness. Sophie screamed softly in the living room. "Mommy!" Her voice trembled, hugging her teddy bear tightly. "It's okay, honey," Grace said, hugging her child, her voice soothing. "It's just raining." Luke turned on the flashlight from his phone and walked over. "We need a safe place. Shall we build a pillow fort?" He smiled reassuringly, sitting down at Sophie's eye level. Sophie's eyes lit up despite her tears. "Really?" Like last time, she looked up, her voice trembling but hopeful. "Like last time, and bigger this time," Luke said, pulling a pile of pillows onto the floor. Within minutes, the three of them had piled up pillows and pulled up blankets, building a fortress in the living room. Sophie's giggles echoed over the sound of the rain outside. Grace sat beside her, her hair falling to her shoulders, her eyes wet, but her lips smiling for the first time that day. When Sophie had fallen asleep in the fortress, Luke and Grace sat in silence side by side. The rain had subsided, leaving only the sound of the child's breathing and their heartbeats. "Thank you," Grace whispered, her eyes on Sophie, but her voice directed at Luke. Luke nodded slightly, his eyes on her as well. "I promised Mark, but really, I'm doing this for myself." His voice was low but clear, like a small confession. Grace turned to look at him. In the dim light of the phone screen, their eyes met, and the silence said it all. It was late fall, and the maple leaves lined the road leading into town. A silver-gray pickup truck rolled slowly through the faded wooden gate. Mark's older brother, Adam, gripped the steering wheel tightly. He had been away from this town for nearly 7 years since he moved to the city for work. Now everything was both familiar and strange, like a dusty memory. He had come back because his mother, Margaret, had just suffered a mild heart attack. But deep down, Adam knew there was another reason rumors about Grace and Luke had reached him. Rumors that his brother's best friend, the one who had sworn to protect Mark's family, was now spending more time with Mark's widow than friends. Adam pulled over when he saw the familiar white wooden house, Grace's house. The maple trees in the front yard were still there, but a small swing was tied to the branches, swaying in the wind. He sat still for a moment, his eyes on the peaceful scene, but inside he was a jumble of emotions, suspicion, anger, and longing for his brother. Grace was sweeping the leaves on the porch when she heard a car stop in front of the gate. She looked up and saw a familiar face. "Adam," her voice was startled, her hand stopped mid-stroke. Adam stepped out of the car, his steps heavy, but his eyes filled with emotion. "Hello, Grace," he said softly, nodding slightly. "It's been a while." Grace put down the broom and moved closer. "I didn't know you were coming back. How's Mom?" Her voice softened, her eyes, genuinely worried. "She's fine. The doctor said she just needs to rest and relax." Adam paused, then glanced out the window, where Sophie was working on a jigsaw puzzle. "And I heard something about you and Luke." The words fell into the air heavy as a stone. Grace squeezed his hand. "Rumors," she said, her voice low and careful. Adam pursed his lips. "Rumors don't happen without something to say, Grace." He turned away, but the accusation was still in his eyes. Before Grace could reply, Sophie's voice rang out from inside the house. "Luke is here." She ran out the door, a bright smile on her face. Adam turned, and just then Luke came through the gate, his familiar tool bag in his hand. The three of them stood face to face, the air thick. Luke was surprised, but he kept his voice calm. Luke Adam nodded, his eyes cold. Long time no see. You're visiting your mother, Luke asked, putting down his bag, trying to keep his voice neutral. And to see what you're doing to my brother's family, Adam said bluntly, his voice firm, but not loud. Sophie looked around, bewildered. Is Adam angry with Luke? The little girl asked, her innocent voice, making the atmosphere sink another level. Grace leaned over to hug her child, whispering, No, honey. The adults are just talking. But inside her, a heavy feeling had just formed. That evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Luke went out to the porch to get some fresh air. He sat down on the steps, his fingers unconsciously drawing circles on the peeling paint. Footsteps echoed behind him. Adam stood there, hands in his pockets, the moonlight reflecting on his hard face. Do you love Grace? Adam asked directly, without beating around the bush. Luke was silent. That's my brother's wife, Luke. The one you call your best friend. Adam clenched his fists. Do you think Mark wants to see this? Luke looked up, his voice low but restrained. I don't know what Mark wants, Adam. All I know is I promised to protect them. And I'm doing just that. Protect? Adam chuckled, shaking his head. You call letting people gossip all over town protection. The gossip isn't true, Luke replied, his voice low but sharp. You're not angry about me. It's because Mark isn't here to protect his wife and kids. The words made Adam pause. For a moment, his face flashed with pain before turning cold again. Keep your distance from Grace, Adam said firmly, and turned back into the house. Luke sat alone, the night wind blowing across the porch. He looked up at the starry sky, the sky he and Mark had once gazed upon. In that moment, Luke felt like he had lost Mark all over again. The next morning, the sunlight was thin and thin, filtering through the early morning mist. Grace was making coffee in the kitchen when she heard a frantic knock on the door. She opened it and found Mark's mother, standing there. Margaret was wearing a thick wool coat, her face stern. Though she was in her 60s, her eyes were as sharp as the day Grace first came to meet her parents. We need to talk, Margaret said, her voice hoarse but firm. No greeting. Grace swallowed, nodded, and invited her in. They sat across from each other at the dining table. Sophie was playing in the other room, but the sound of toys clanking together echoed faintly. It felt like a fragile piece about to shatter. Margaret placed her thin but hard hands on the table. Grace, it's been less than 2 years since Mark died. And yet... She took a deep breath, her voice choked, but not softening. And yet, you let Luke into this house so much. Grace remained silent. Her eyes fell to her coffee, the steam blurring the edges of her eyes. What did you promise, Mark? Margaret continued, her voice strained. Promise to love and be faithful. Promise to keep this family together. I see Luke here every week. The whole town sees him. He helped me, Grace said softly, her hands tightening on the hem of her shirt. He helped Sophie, helped me get up. Helped. Margaret laughed dryly, her eyes wet, but reproachful. Are you sure, or are you just looking for someone to replace Mark? Grace looked up, her eyes red, but determined. Do you think I don't miss Mark every day? Do you think I'm happy to see people talking? Her voice shook, but each word fell heavily on the wooden table. But I don't want Sophie to grow up in a house filled with silence and tears. Margaret paused for a second, then took a deep breath. You're making excuses, Grace. You're making a mess of things. No, Grace whispered, her voice tight but firm. I'm trying to survive. The words silenced the kitchen. Margaret turned away quickly, wiping away her tears. But as she left, her shadow still left a chill in Grace's back. That evening, Luke stopped by after work. He noticed the change in the atmosphere. Grace was quiet, her eyes sad. What's wrong? Luke asked softly, setting his tool bag down on the table. Grace hesitated, then recounted the conversation with Margaret. Her voice trailed off as she spoke of the accusations, her hands clasped together to keep her composure. Luke was silent for a long moment. Finally he said, Grace, if you want me to back off, I will. Grace looked up, her eyes wide. What did you say? I don't want to make things harder for you, Luke said, his voice low but calm. I can keep my distance. Grace shook her head slightly, her eyes red. Don't. You're the only one who makes me feel I'm not alone. Her voice was tight, but so sincere that Luke was left speechless. He didn't reply. He just placed his hand lightly on the table, near hers, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth. The next day, the quiet morning of the small town was disturbed by rumors that spread faster than the autumn wind. In the elementary school yard, the voices of children were everywhere, laughing, calling out to each other. But among the children, a small group whispered, "My mom said that Uncle Luke lives with Sophie's mom. No, he's just visiting. But they're getting married." Sophie stood a few steps away, clutching her small pink lunchbox. Her eyes were wide and bewildered, not understanding what her friends were saying, but the feeling of being noticed made her shrink. A taller boy, his voice teasing. "So where's your real dad? Is Uncle Luke your dad?" Sophie clenched her lunchbox, feeling her throat tighten. "No, my dad is Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's in heaven." "So what is Uncle Luke to you?" A little girl interrupted, curious and laughing. Sophie didn't answer. She ran into the classroom, tears welling up in her eyes. At the end of the lesson, Mrs. Taylor, Sophie's homeroom teacher, called Grace to the school. When Grace entered the teacher's room, she found Sophie sitting silently in the corner, holding an extra teddy bear in her backpack. Her eyes red. "What's wrong?" Grace asked. Her voice panicked as she bent over her daughter. Sophie hugged her mother tightly. They asked, "Is Luke your dad?" Her voice trailed off. Grace took a deep breath, feeling her heart constrict. She turned to Mrs. Taylor, a woman in her 40s, her hair tied back, her eyes warm but stern. "I know children repeat what they hear from adults," Mrs. Taylor said softly but firmly. "Gossip travels fast in this small town. Sophie's been put in a difficult situation, and she's not old enough to protect herself." Grace nodded, hugging her daughter tighter. "I'm sorry. I'll talk to her. And—" She paused, her eyes on the floor. "And Luke?" Mrs. Taylor smiled sympathetically. "The best thing for Sophie now is to help her understand that she's not to blame, and that love, even if it comes later, is not wrong." That made Grace pause. Part of her felt comforted, and part of her felt as if she'd been stripped bare. That evening at Grace's house, Luke dropped by with a new toy for Sophie, a teddy bear in a red sweater. Sophie hugged Luke as soon as he walked in, but there was still a hint of sadness in her eyes. "What's wrong?" Luke asked, softly, glancing at Grace. Grace nodded. "We need to talk. After Sophie goes to sleep." Luke looked at her, then nodded in agreement. He sat down on the floor, helping Sophie with the puzzle, her laughter returning. But Grace stood in the kitchen doorway, clutching the hem of her dress, her heart in turmoil. She knew. Tonight, she would have to admit what they had both been avoiding: true feelings, and the price they paid for them in the face of rumors. The town's fall festival was the biggest event of the year. Popcorn stands, caramel apples, and a Ferris wheel set up in the middle of the square. Country music blared, mixed with children's laughter and calls to each other. Grace had been hesitant all morning. She knew the festival would be crowded, and the rumors about her and Luke were still fresh. But Sophie was too excited to say no. And Luke, when he asked quietly, "Do you want me to come with you?" Grace was silent for only a second before nodding. They arrived at the festival together, Sophie running ahead with a balloon tied to her wrist. The golden sunlight spread across the square, making her curly brown hair glow. "Watch out, little one," Luke called after her, laughing as he walked. His voice was tinged with worry, but not hidden by joy. Grace walked beside him, clutching her bag, her eyes scanning the crowd. She felt a few stares, a few whispers, but she tried to keep her smile calm. "Are you okay?" Luke asked quietly, tilting his head. "Okay," Grace replied, her voice soft but trembling. "I'm just not used to people looking at me like this." Luke nodded, his hand hanging loosely at his side, as if to hold hers, but stopping short. "If you're uncomfortable, we can go home early." "No." Grace looked at Sophie, who was laughing loudly in front of the game booth, her eyes softening. She deserves to have fun today. Sophie played a game of ring toss and won a giant blue stuffed animal. "Look, Luke." She held up her prize, beaming. "Good job," Luke laughed, ruffling her hair. Grace laughed along, feeling relieved for the first time in days. In that moment they truly looked like a family, and perhaps that was why everyone around them looked at them a little longer. As dusk fell, the yellow lanterns lit up the entire festival. The music slowed down, turning into a gentle melody. "Want to go on the Ferris wheel?" Sophie pulled her mother's hand, her eyes sparkling. Grace looked up at the brightly lit Ferris wheel, then at Luke. He just smiled slightly. "Let's go." They sat in the small cabin, Sophie in the middle, hugging a stuffed animal. As the cabin rose, the entire town shrank below tiny wooden roofs amidst a sea of yellow leaves. "So beautiful," Sophie whispered, her cheek pressed against the window. Grace stole a glance at Luke. He was admiring the view, his face relaxed, but there was something deeper in his eyes. Something she knew clearly, but pretended not to know. In that moment, she suddenly realized she didn't want to hide it anymore. When the Ferris wheel stopped, the crowd grew tighter as the fireworks were about to start. In the chaos of lights and cheers, Sophie suddenly disappeared from sight. Sophie Grace screamed, her voice panicked. She turned around, her eyes scanning the crowd. Luke immediately grabbed her hand. "I'll find her." "You stay here," he shouted over the noise, his eyes tense but his voice firm. Grace shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, I won't let you go alone. Trust me." Luke squeezed her hand gently and rushed into the crowd, his voice. Sophie echoing over the sound of fireworks exploding in the sky. In the maze of people and noise, Luke ran through the stalls, his eyes darting in all directions. He caught a glimpse of a pink balloon stuck on a tree branch near the small lake outside the festival. "Sophie," he called, his voice hoarse. A small cry rang out. Under the tree, Sophie was hugging a teddy bear, her eyes brimming with tears. "Uncle Luke?" she sobbed as he rushed over. "It's okay, little one." Luke knelt down, hugging her tightly, his voice trembling but relieved. As Luke carried Sophie back into the festival, Grace rushed to hug her, tears welling up in her eyes. I thought I'd lost you," she whispered, her voice choked, holding Sophie close to her chest. "No," Luke said, his voice hoarse but firm. "I would never let that happen." Grace looked up, their eyes meeting in the glow of the fireworks behind them. And for the first time, Grace didn't avoid her gaze. 3 days after the festival, Luke returned to his daily routine at the small machine shop outside town. He was wiping his oily hands when he heard the door open and a familiar female voice. Luke Bennett. The voice was bright with a hint of surprise and joy. Luke looked up and stopped short. Rachel. She was an old colleague from the city who had worked with him on a big project 3 years ago. Rachel had shoulder-length blonde hair and a confident smile, like someone who was used to a bustling environment. "Rachel, what are you doing here?" Luke asked, his voice both surprised and wary. Rachel walked over, placing her bag on the table. "I transferred down here for a few months. I didn't expect to see you in this small town." She smiled brightly, her eyes scanning Luke curiously. That afternoon, when Luke took Sophie from school to Grace's house, Rachel happened to pass by the neighborhood. She stopped the car, rolled down the window, and waved. "Luke, are you here?" Her voice was cheerful, the afternoon sunlight shining on her blonde hair. Grace was sweeping the leaves on the porch and looked up. Her eyes were momentarily stunned when she saw the strange woman chatting intimately with Luke. This is Grace, my friend," Luke introduced quickly, his voice a little hesitant. Rachel smiled, holding out her hand. "Hello, Grace. I heard a lot about him at the old company. Turns out you're the famous Uncle Luke in this town." Her voice was a little playful, but Grace unconsciously tightened her grip on the broom handle. Grace smiled politely. "Really?" Her voice was soft, but inside she felt an indescribable feeling. Not exactly jealousy, but uneasiness. Sophie squeezed in, hugging Luke's leg. "Uncle Luke, who is this?" She looked up and asked, her eyes curious. "Just an old friend of yours, little one," Luke replied, bending down to pat Sophie's head. Rachel laughed. "So cute. She looks like my little sister when she was little." That night, when Luke came home, Grace was alone in the kitchen, washing dishes, but her mind was wandering. She remembered Rachel's smile, the naturalness with which she called Luke's name, and the way Luke responded, more familiar than just friends. She blamed herself. She had no right to feel uncomfortable. But why did her heart feel so heavy? The sound of footsteps startled Grace. Luke stood in the kitchen doorway, hands in his pockets. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, but noting her gaze. Grace smiled awkwardly. "Fine." Luke frowned but did not press the question. He knew Grace. She did not open up easily when her emotions were in turmoil. In the silence, the sound of running water mingled with the ticking of the clock. The distance between them seemed close, but also so far that they could not touch. The next day, Rachel showed up at school, where she volunteered to help with the fundraising event. Coincidentally, Grace was there too. "Grace," Rachel called out, waving her hand, smiling brightly. "Lucky to meet you here." Grace nodded slightly, trying to smile. "Yeah, what a coincidence." Rachel stepped closer. Her voice excited. Luke told her a lot about you and Sophie. He really cares about you too. Grace paused. What did he tell her? Part of her wanted to ask, but she just pursed her lips and smiled faintly. He's kind. Everyone knows that. Rachel laughed. Yeah, it's rare to meet a man like him. I even joked that if no one had taken him first, I would have noticed. Her voice was soft, but enough for Grace to hear clearly. Grace was silent. The smile on her lips suddenly disappeared. Only the sound of her heart pounding in her chest remained. That evening, when Luke dropped off Sophie's new toy, Grace opened the door, her eyes unusual. What's wrong? Luke asked, his voice low as he noticed the sudden coldness. Nothing. Grace replied quickly, but her voice was hard. You seem to be busy with an old friend. Luke frowned. Grace. He tried to explain but stopped. He saw something in her eyes that was both painful and scary, a feeling he knew all too well because he had it himself. A long moment of silence with only Sophie's laughter in the living room, completely unaware of the silent storm brewing between the adults. The afternoon was overcast, with low gray clouds hanging over the town. Grace's cottage was filled with an unprecedented heaviness. Adam stood by the window, his arms crossed. Margaret sat in the armchair, her eyes red but hard. Grace stood near the kitchen table, clutching her lapels, and Luke sat silently on the porch, trying to keep his cool. Rumors of Grace's new family spread after the festival. Rachel's arrival added to the chaos. The small town was like a boiling pot, and Adam, after days of forbearance, finally decided to confront her. I'll be blunt, Adam began, his voice low but sharp. I don't believe you're here because of your promise to Mark anymore. Luke clenched his fists. What do you mean? He said, his voice low, trying to keep his cool. Adam took a step forward, his eyes blazing. I think you're using Grace. You're using Mark's absence to intrude into her life, and Sophie's. Grace took a deep breath and stepped forward to stop him. Adam, don't say that. Shut up, Grace. Adam whirled around, his voice harsh but shaking with emotion. My brother died less than 2 years ago, and you let his best friend into your life. Margaret stood up, her voice hoarse. Adam's right. This isn't right, Grace. I lost a son. I don't want to lose my niece to some vague relationship. Not vague. Grace burst out, tears welling up in her eyes. We never wanted this. But it happened. I was lonely. Sophie needed someone. And Luke was there. That's the worst excuse I've ever heard, Adam growled. Mark would be heartbroken if he knew. Luke finally spoke, his voice hoarse but firm. Mark knows. The room fell silent. Before he died, Mark asked me to take care of Grace and Sophie. Luke continued, his eyes fixed on Adam. He knew I loved them, and he trusted me. Adam chuckled, his shoulders shaking slightly with anger. Trust you to replace him. No one can replace Mark, Luke replied, his voice low but choked. I don't want to either. I just don't want them to live in the dark forever. Margaret stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined. If you keep this up, I'll ask for custody of Sophie. At least I'll have my son's memory. Grace was stunned, her eyes wide. You can't do that. Her voice broke. I can, Margaret replied, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her voice was as hard as steel. And I will if it's the only way to keep Sophie away from this. Grace stepped back, her arms crossed over her chest. Fear welled up, not just of losing Sophie, but of losing the fragile, budding happiness. Luke stepped forward, his eyes soft but firm. Margaret, I understand your pain, but taking Sophie away from her mother, from the person who loved her the most, would hurt Sophie more than all of us combined. Do you think you know what's best for my niece? Better than I do. Margaret asked, her voice broken but stubborn. No, Luke shook his head. I just know. Mark wouldn't want Sophie to grow up hating. Silence filled the room. Adam turned away, his jaw clenched. Margaret sat down shakily in her chair. Grace was caught between two worlds, one of Mark's memories, the other of Luke's present, and she didn't know how much longer she could hold on to either. In that moment, Sophie ran out of the next room, clutching her teddy bear, looking at the adults in bewilderment. Are you arguing? Her voice trembled small but echoed throughout the house. That innocent question was like a knife cutting through the thick air. All was silent. It was dark, and a cold wind was blowing in through the workshop window. Luke sat alone on the wooden bench, clutching Mark's old towel that he always kept in the toolbox. Adam and Margaret's words still echoed in his head. You used Grace? You replaced Mark. He couldn't deny the guilt that was eating away at him. Every time he saw Sophie smile, he felt both happy and heavy-hearted. What right did I have to be here? What right did I have to love that woman? The phone rang. Grace was calling. Luke looked at the screen, but didn't answer. He was afraid her voice would pull him back while he was pushing himself away. He drove out of town, stopping at the lake where he and Mark used to fish. The ripples reflected the moonlight. Luke looked up at the sky and whispered, "Mark, am I doing the right thing, or am I betraying you?" His voice was hoarse, choked by the night wind. There was no answer. There was only the sound of the wind and memories. Mark's laughter, the image of Grace holding Sophie, and the look in his eyes as he asked for help one last time in the hospital. Luke let out a soft laugh, a painful laugh. "You always leave me in trouble," he said to himself, his voice choked but tinged with bitterness. Meanwhile, Grace stood in front of her window, looking out at the empty street. The phone in her hand kept flashing and turning off as she called Luke. There was no response. Sophie was asleep, but Grace was not. Her heart was in turmoil, afraid of losing Luke, angry that he left, and tormented by the memory of Mark still there. She whispered in the night, "I don't know what to do." Her voice trembled, her hand placed on her chest, as if to keep her heart from breaking. A week later, Grace decided to clean out the attic, where Mark's mementos were kept. Among the dusty cardboard boxes, she found a small wooden box with a rusty lock. Inside, in addition to a few photos and an old movie ticket, was a sealed envelope with a familiar handwriting. "To Grace and Luke, if you ever read it." Grace opened the letter with trembling hands. Mark's words appeared simple but powerful. "Grace, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there. I know Luke will keep his promise, because he always does. But I also know Luke loved you, and I never blamed him for that. If you ever smile at Luke, please don't feel guilty. Love each other the way I loved you, wholeheartedly and without fear. And Luke, you've been my brother for a long time. If you make Grace happy, I know I'll be happy somewhere up there." Signed, Mark. Grace sat down on the floor, tears falling uncontrollably, but they were tears of relief. Years of torment, sleepless nights, all melted away in a few lines from Mark. She folded the letter, hugged it to her chest, and whispered, "Thank you." Her voice was choked, but relieved for the first time in 2 years. That night, Grace looked for Luke. She drove to the lakeside, where he often went. Luke sat there, a silent figure in the moonlight. When he saw Grace approaching, he was about to stand up, but she reached out, handing him the letter. "You need to read this," Grace said, her voice soft but firm. Luke opened the letter, his eyes skimming over each word, and then stopping. His whole body trembled slightly. When he finished reading, he clenched the paper, took a deep breath. "Mark," he whispered softly, his voice choked. Grace stepped closer. "He wants us to be happy, not to forget him, but to live on, for him." Luke looked at Grace for a long time. In the moonlight, his tears glistened. But this time, they were not guilt, but relief. He nodded slightly. "I want to try again, with you and Sophie." Grace smiled softly, tears streaming down her face, but her face brighter than ever. "Me too." They stood there silent, but understanding. In the distance, waves lapped against the shore, bringing with them a sense of serenity not felt since Mark left. The next morning the sky was a rare blue after days of gray clouds. Grace stood outside Margaret's house, clutching Mark's letter. Her heart was beating fast, not just from nervousness, but also from hope. Hope that a few lines from Mark would heal the distance between them. The door opened, and Margaret appeared thin, but her eyes still hard. Adam stood behind his mother. Arms crossed his gaze, a mixture of wariness and exhaustion. "Grace," Margaret said softly, her voice cold but no longer as harsh as before. "What are you doing here?" Grace took a deep breath and held out the envelope. "This letter Mark wrote to us before he died." Margaret paused. Adam frowned but took it. They opened the letter. Mark's words appeared, sincere and warm. "If one day Grace smiles at Luke, please don't feel guilty. Let's love each other the way I loved you, wholeheartedly and without fear. And Luke, if you make Grace happy, I'll be happy somewhere up there." The room was silent. Only the ticking of the clock and Margaret's choked breathing could be heard. Her hands trembled, her eyes were wet. "Mark," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He knows everything." Adam stood beside her, clutching the envelope. His shoulders tensed and then slumped. "He never blamed us," Adam said softly, his voice low and choked. "He just wanted everyone to be happy." Grace looked at the two of them, her voice softening. "I never forgot Mark. But Sophie needs a home. I need to learn to live too." Margaret wiped her tears, stepping closer to Grace. "I'm sorry. I was so stubborn. I was just afraid. If I let go of Mark, I'd lose my son." Grace squeezed her hand, tears welling in her eyes. "You'll never lose Mark. He's still here. In Sophie, in all of us." Adam watched the scene, then sighed, placing his hand on Luke's shoulder, who had been standing on the porch since the beginning. "Luke," Adam said, his voice hoarse but sincere, "if you make Grace and Sophie happy, we will stand by you." Luke nodded, his voice low but firm. "You have my word." That afternoon, Grace, Luke, Adam, and Margaret sat around the small dining table, the first time in years that they had talked without tension. Sophie ran around, laughter filling the house. Margaret watched her, smiling slightly. "She looks like Mark when he was little, but she has Grace's eyes," she said, her voice softening. "And the stubbornness is mutual," Adam added, drawing a small chuckle. "No more gossip, no more judgment, just people learning to forgive and move on." The town square was decorated with warm yellow lights and rows of white daisies, Mark's favorite flower. The autumn wind blew gently, carrying the scent of dry leaves and the sad guitar music of the local orchestra. It was Mark's Memorial Day, 2 years since he had left. The whole town had gathered, neighbors, old friends, former colleagues of Mark's, and even strangers who had come to mourn the loss of a good man. Grace held Sophie's hand tightly as they entered the square. Sophie was wearing a pale blue dress, holding the teddy bear she had won at the festival. Luke walked beside her, his posture quiet but steady. It was the first time they had appeared in public together since the rumors had spread. Glances turned to them, some sympathetic nods, some questioning looks. Grace felt her heart pounding, but Luke's hand squeezed hers, conveying a strange sense of peace. Adam and Margaret were already standing in the front row. When they saw Luke, Grace, Sophie approaching Adam, took a step forward. "Come here," he said shortly, his voice still low but no longer cold. Grace was surprised, but nodded. The three of them walked over and sat down next to Adam and Margaret, the family sitting together in a row for the first time since Mark's death. The ceremony began. The mayor read a few words of remembrance, Mark's contributions to the community, his cheerful personality, and kindness. As the music played, Mark's image was projected onto the big screen, his bright smile, his warm eyes. Sophie whispered to her mother, "Mom, that's Dad." Her voice was soft but firm, making Grace hug her tightly. As the ceremony drew to a close, Adam suddenly stepped onto the stage. He took the microphone, his voice hoarse but clear. "I am Mark's brother. I used to be angry, because I thought someone was replacing my brother. But today, when I read Mark's words, I understood. What Mark wanted was for us to be happy." He paused, looking straight at the crowd. "Some people will talk, but if you really knew Mark, you'd know he would want it." The square fell silent for a beat. Then a few claps broke out, soft at first, then widespread. Not everyone agreed, but the moment marked a major shift. The town began to look at Luke, Grace, Sophie differently. As the white confetti went up at the end of the ceremony, Grace stood next to Luke, tears streaming down her face, but no longer from sadness, but from relief. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at Adam and Margaret chatting with Sophie, "for staying." Luke tilted his head, smiling slightly. "I promised." They stood side by side, no words needed. The autumn sky was bluer than usual that day. Grace's backyard was filled with Sophie's laughter early in the morning. She ran around the big maple tree, her sketchbook in hand, a tree house with round windows and a rope ladder. "Luke, remember what you promised." "We're building a tree house today," Sophie exclaimed, her eyes sparkling. Luke smiled and put down his toolbox. "You promised, kid. We're starting today." He rolled up his sleeves, his eyes filled with determination, not just for the treehouse, but for the new beginning for all three of them. Grace stepped out onto the porch, holding a cup of coffee. She watched Luke measure the wood, Sophie passed the nails, and her heart softened. Maybe This was the family Mark wanted. All day long they worked together. The sound of hammers mingled with laughter. "Higher, Uncle! I want to see the whole town," Sophie shouted from the branches. "High enough, or your mother will worry," Luke replied, smiling, as he balanced on the ladder. Grace stood below her hand, covering her forehead as she looked up. "Be careful." Her voice was half worried, half happy. "I'm always careful." "When you're looking," Luke replied softly, causing Grace to pause for a second, her cheeks flushing slightly. By afternoon, the treehouse had taken shape, small but cozy, with round windows overlooking the fields. Sophie climbed up shouting, "My house is the most beautiful in the world." Grace and Luke stood at the base, looking at each other. For the first time, they didn't have to hide their smiles, didn't have to hide their emotions. A week later, the treehouse was complete. Inside hung family photos, Mark, Grace, Sophie, and now Luke. Not to replace, but to connect the past with the present. That morning, the three of them sat on the porch for breakfast. The early morning sunlight filtered through the yellow maple trees, and the smell of pancakes filled the yard. There were no more whispers on the street, no more judgmental looks, just Sophie's laughter and the gentle wind. "Luke," Sophie said, stuffing pancakes into her mouth. "What are you to me now?" Luke and Grace exchanged glances. Grace smiled, slightly leaning down. "What do you think he is?" Sophie tilted her head, thinking, then said, "You're like family." Luke paused, his heart clenching, but this time it was with happiness. He placed his hand on the table near Grace's. She didn't pull it away. That afternoon, Sophie played in the newly built treehouse. The baby's singing echoed down the yard, the lullaby Mark used to sing, now mixed with childish laughter. Grace and Luke stood side by side under the tree looking up. "Do you think Mark would be proud of us?" Grace asked softly, her voice as light as the wind. Luke smiled, his eyes looking up at the clear blue sky. "I'm sure he would." They held hands, no promises, no explanations. Just the present moment, peaceful, complete, and open to the future. Up above the treehouse swayed gently in the autumn wind. A new beginning, simple but solid, like their love. The story of Grace, Luke, and Sophie ends here, not with a perfect ending, but with a new beginning. They have learned to forgive the past, cherish the present, and bravely open their hearts to happiness again. Sometimes love is not about forgetting the person who has passed away, but about living on to keep them in your heart and giving yourself the chance to be loved again. If you are going through difficult days, I hope this story reminds you that happiness never disappears. It just changes shape and waits for us to open our hearts to receive it. Thank you for watching until the end. If you love warm and emotional stories like this, please subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next episodes. And if this story touches your heart, don't forget to leave a comment to share your feelings. See you in the next story.